Okay, this video is on independence and conditional probability. Now, remember that we say two events are independent when neither event influences the other. And this is usually easy to determine if we know what the events are. For example, if we know that one of the events is rolling a die and the other event is drawing a card from a deck of cards. It's easy to tell that those two events don't have any influence on the other, therefore they're independent events. Well, what if we don't actually know what the events are? We just refer to the events as A and B. Well, if we know something about the probabilities, the numerical probabilities of those events, then we can figure out if those events are independent. In particular, there are three tests that we can use to determine if two events are independent. The first test, if the probability of A and B is equal to the probability of A times the probability of B, then we can say the events are independent. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, this looks kind of like the multiplication rule. And it does kind of look like the multiplication rule. The multiplication rule, remember, looks like the probability of A and B equals probability of A times the probability of B, given that event A has already happened. Well, this looks kind of like this, except for this part right here. And the reason that they don't look the same is because the multiplication rule is a general rule. It can be used for any two events. This, if this is true, then we know that the two events, A and B, have to be independent. All right? Now, another rule, or rather another test that I could use to see if two events are independent is if the probability of B, given that A has already happened, if that is equal to just the probability of B, then I know that events A and B must be independent. In the same way, if the probability of event A, given that event B has already happened, if this probability is equal to just the probability of A, well then I know the events are independent. So if I can answer yes to any of these three questions, then I know that events A and B are independent. Notice that I only need to verify that one of these three statements is true. And if one of them is true, then all of them are true. One more thing to note, if I already know, let's say if you already know that events A and B are independent, then each of these three statements here must be true. In other words, I can use these three statements if I have two events and I'm trying to figure out if they're independent. Well, I can use these three statements kind of as a test and test to see if any of them are true. And if any are true, then I know my events must be independent. If, however, I have two events and I already know that they're independent, well then I know that each of these three statements here must be true.